Hello, I'm Fred Lorem, Chairman and President of Rhode Island Hospital Trust National Bank. In the history of our nation, few conflicts have generated such controversy as the war in Vietnam. This program examines that war from the perspective of those who served their country with honor. That's why Hospital Trust is proud to sponsor Vietnam, A Time to Remember.
United States, since the end of the Geneva Accord, setting up the South Vietnamese government as an independent government, has been assisting Vietnam.
Over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence, and I intend to keep that promise.
Throughout the years of negotiation, we have insisted on peace with honor.
July 12, 1957. National Network Intelligence reports enemy bombers over Augusta, Maine. Traffic is halted in Providence as Rhode Islanders seek protection in backyard fallout shelters and designated public buildings. Their only defense? A ring of Nike missile sites located in Bristol, Coventry, and Foster. Inside secure bunkers, guarded by attack dogs, and manned round the clock, Army personnel strive to intercept the assault. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a 5-megaton nuclear device narrowly misses the capital, but strikes the tip of Prudence Island. In a single blinding flash of light, 98,000 residents are reduced to ashes. That is the official death toll, according to Civil Defense Headquarters, the agency that wrote the scenario for this drill. One of 4 conducted nationwide in 1957. The enemy is the Soviet Union, bulwark of communism. No understanding of America's involvement in Vietnam is possible without an appreciation of the fear invoked by the prospect of communist expansion.
God bless America. Let the dead lie low, step beside the horse and guide the horse to the next with the light from above.
At the close of the Second World War, America watched anxiously as the Soviet Union absorbed most of Eastern Europe. In the early 1950s, UN forces have repulsed a communist invasion of South Korea. But as the Cold War grows colder, the prospects for new confrontations loom large. Halfway around the world, a tiny country is fighting to free itself from years of French colonial rule. The Eisenhower administration spends millions in support of France's efforts, yet few Americans have ever heard of Vietnam. Intrigued by the possibility that covert action may succeed where French armed forces have failed, John F. Kennedy provides thousands of military advisors to South Vietnam. Their mission? To suppress the communist-led insurrection threatening the regime of President Diem. But Kennedy begins to have second thoughts. he sends a delegation headed by Senator Mike Mansfield to Vietnam on a fact-finding tour. Mansfield, accompanied by Senator Claiborne Pell, is granted an audience with DM.
The president simply talked at us for 3 hours and more, not giving us an opportunity to say anything. It was not important what I said or did not say, but what was important was that Senator Mansfield himself was not given the opportunity to talk, and he'd been really the savior of this man for all these years. So I felt that the government was that was represented, the government was way off course and out of touch with the people.
In November 1963, Diem is murdered in a coup that we now know had the tacit support of the United States and the assistance of the CIA. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy is assassinated. Responsibility for America's role in Vietnam passes to a new commander-in-chief.
General quarters, all hands manual.
In August 1964, a confrontation between North Vietnamese patrol boats and the U.S. Navy gives Johnson the leverage needed to extract a resolution from Congress that amounts to a de facto declaration of war. It will be years before the American public learns that the first encounter may have been provoked by naval espionage conducted against the North Vietnamese, and that the report of a second battle was almost certainly an error or a fabrication.
If we turn away from knowledge and truth, we will not succeed. If we believe the worst and suspect the best, we alone will suffer. If we tear down our accomplishments, we will fill the world with sorrow, and we'll blemish our own name with shame.
I think that Johnson did conceal from the public the degree of commitment that he was willing to make. My reading is that Johnson, as early as March of 1964, had committed himself in principle to going to war against North Vietnam. Johnson didn't see any percentage in announcing something that was going to make people unhappy until you had to.
Across the nation, a small but vocal anti-war movement begins to make itself heard. To ensure widespread support for its policies, the Johnson administration sponsors a number of carefully controlled tours of Vietnam for local politicians.
Do you feel from your visit to Vietnam that the war is going to be a bottomless pit for the United States?
I think that we're on the way up over there in South Vietnam, and I don't think it's a bottomless pit.
A few weeks ago, former Vice President Nixon indicated that negotiations to end the war really were not the way out because we had very little to negotiate.
I do agree that the chances of negotiation out there, in my opinion, are practically zero, because how can you negotiate when a robber has moved into your house and you want to get rid of him? You're going to only drive him out.
The idea that South Vietnam is being invaded by the North is accepted by the majority of Americans. Few realize that Vietnam had been temporarily divided in 1954 with the promise of free elections, a promise that was broken.
If you want to look at it from their point of view, it was under the Geneva Agreement that they were supposed to withdraw north of the 17th parallel and from Laos and Cambodia. And to the extent that other parties to the agreement weren't paying any attention to provisions like the elections provisions for South Vietnam, it's quite possible that Ho Chi Minh felt that he had no obligation to continue to obey those provisions that kept his troops within the territory of North Vietnam.
Launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Independence, jet bombers strike targets deep in North Vietnam. For one Navy pilot, a similar mission will end in disaster. Lieutenant Commander Porter Halliburton recalls the experience of being shot down and captured behind enemy lines.
Well, I think a certain amount of disbelief, initially, and then some despair. Of course, they threatened to kill me a number of times during this interrogation thing when I'd refused to write or answer or anything like that. And at that point, I really didn't care whether they shot me or not, because I didn't think that the future was going to be all that pleasant.
U.S. Marines are sent to the edge of the demilitarized zone to prevent further enemy infiltration. Operation Hastings is an initial success, but as American troops are being withdrawn, the North Vietnamese launch a savage counterattack.
As we started to cross the river, we started receiving heavy weapons fire, small arms fire, and it just went nuts after that. They caught us, they had us totally surrounded. I cried because I knew we weren't getting out of this. There's just no way. They had a few Marines out feeling their way out throughout this makeshift hasty perimeter that we made, and there was no way out. They caught us with our pants down. We thought we kicked their ass up there on the top of that hill. They came down and the whole brunt of that regiment was on our ass. They laid into us. And I think of 112 Marines out of that company, only 22 survived, including myself.
No amount of secrecy can hide the casualties and death that are the true cost of war. Yet the early years of America's involvement in Vietnam are marked by intrigue.
One morning they woke me up after the night shift to tell me, you're on top secret orders, you're leaving Saturday. Do not tell anybody, do not tell your roommate, do not pack, do not tell your family. You can make arrangements from a distance to do something with your car.
The United States is soon entangled in a brutal civil war, replete with ancient hatreds and whispered horrors.
We had prisoner patients that needed to be interrogated. The scuttlebutt, though, was that once they were well enough to be interrogated, depended on whose prisoner they were, but generally speaking, they were prisoners of the South Vietnamese Army, and their policy was to interrogate the heck out of the patient and take him up in a helicopter and throw him out the window, throw him out the door. And so, you know, that's a conflict to save this guy's life in order that this all happen.
U.S. Air Force and Navy jets bombed fuel installations in the Hanoi-Haiphong area. In retaliation, North Vietnam threatens to put American POWs on trial as war criminals.
Well, they didn't put us on trial or execute anybody, but they did institute a new policy that they were going to break all of us, and they were going to force us to make a choice, you know, whether we were going to be for them or against them. And of course everybody was going to be against them, so they wound up torturing almost everybody.
Unauthorized negotiations with a foreign power is a violation of the Logan Act, punishable by up to 3 years in a federal prison. But in an attempt to end the hostilities, Senator Claiborne Pell arranges a secret meeting in Paris with North Vietnamese diplomat Mai Van Bo.
I didn't know when I was doing this because the passenger lists are made public, whether I'd find 2 Marines at the bottom of the gangplank of the airplane arresting me for violation of the Logan Act, or whether I'd be allowed to proceed my way. I was allowed to proceed my way, had a long conversation, about a 3-hour luncheon with Mai Van Bo. I thought this time I'm going to insist on going to the top because this is of national importance. And I got my way in to see President Johnson, gave him a full report of our conversation.
Johnson listens, but takes no action. The war continues. Frustrated by its inability to alter government policy, the anti-war movement adopts more militant tactics. In Washington, D.C., demonstrators surround the Pentagon. Army troops are soon face to face with protesters.
The troops were scared. They'd been given guns and told they couldn't shoot them. And some of them probably deeply resented us, and some of them probably wanted to be on our side. And so you could see fear in their eyes, and they were very taut, like a rope stretched ready to break.
The rift between those who support the war and those who oppose it now widens to a chasm. Hawk against dove. parent against child.
You can't always be polite. Now, I got in trouble. I got in a lot of trouble from my parents. My mother said, you're trying to destroy the system. And my father was so mad with me we couldn't talk together. We wrote letters. We exchanged letters back and forth about our views on the war because they didn't understand.
In Vietnam, the cost of war, in blood and treasure, is mounting daily. At home, the growing conflict threatens to tear America apart. The tension seems intolerable. Yet this test of a nation's character is just beginning.
Vietnam, a time to remember, will continue.
January 1968. A massive enemy attack launched during the Vietnamese holiday called Tet brings the fighting into downtown Saigon. An ominous beginning for a year that will see some of the bloodiest combat of the war. American troops increasingly find themselves confronting battle-hardened elements of the North Vietnamese army. For one company, the clash occurs during a deadly ambush set in the heart of a territory known as the Valley of the Dragon.
We knew in advance what we were going into. You know, I mean, a lot of times they'd say, you know, hey, diddle diddle straight up the middle, is they just send you up a small unit to see if they would make contact with you, and then come in with a larger unit and clean up. "67 of us went out and we took 33 casualties, including myself. I was one of the last ones hit that day. Just went down, didn't realize what happened at first, and it sort of dawned on me that, you know, I'd just been shot. I can remember I arrived just about the time the first helicopter was coming down, so instead of putting me down, they just threw me into the helicopter and started throwing people in with me, on top of me, and everywhere they could fit people, because there's a lot of casualties. And just sat there waiting for that bird to take off, and I figured if I could count to 10, he'd be high enough. We'd never get shot down. And I knew that was it. I was home.
The innocent are seldom spared in war, and Vietnam is no exception. At Tuy Hoa, a hospital is established to treat civilians trapped between opposing forces.
We were there, and I'm sure some of the injuries they had were our problem, the little children with wounds that got caught in the crossfire, and repairs. But there were many injuries that you wonder how they tolerated, but they did. And they, I don't ever remember them complaining. There was one child in particular, she had had not a war injury, but she had had polio and couldn't walk. When they found her in the village, she was getting around on her hands and knees and that, just crawling. So they did some surgery for her to be able to walk. She had braces, and so those were the kinds of things that you don't hear about, but that did happen.
The struggle to win, not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the people, continues aided in part by Navy construction battalions or Seabees.
We actually went in and lived with the villages for a short period of time while we did the work that we had to do. The problem they were having early on was that we would go into a village in the day and they'd be on our side, and then at night the VC would move in and basically destroy everything that you worked for all day long. You would actually go in and try to win over the Vietnamese to your ways, why we were there, and you do that basically by helping them do stuff that they couldn't do. Some of the things they needed were wells right there. We didn't have to walk a couple of miles for water. We built aid stations so they didn't have to go miles to be treated for injuries.
Despite such efforts, some of the rural population are more inclined to offer their services to the enemy.
We'd go through a village and we'd watch, a 75-year-old man. We knew he was counting us. We could almost see his head nodding as we went by. In fact, sometimes jokingly, I'd walk up to somebody I knew was doing it and say, 32 soldiers, 2 Tiger Scouts,
one dog and walk on. But we knew what was going on.
Yet to many American soldiers, the people they've been sent to defend seem loyal only to the land itself.
I came to the conclusion, first of all, that, and as I look back on it, that conclusion hasn't changed, that the people that we saw the most of were simply peasants. They were farmers. They were trying to eke out a living and a bare subsistence in the middle of a war. They weren't loyal to any government. They were just trying to stay alive and hope that a bomb didn't land on their house or in the middle of their rice paddy, or that their water buffalo or their ducks didn't get caught in the crossfire of machine guns.
Not every attempt to halt the spread of communism ends in failure.
I went to Bolivia and pulled some duty in a couple of years in Latin America in the counterinsurgency business, and was seeing that we were able to put the guerrillas out of business, particularly in Bolivia, because there was an awful lot of popular support for the government that Che Guevara and company were trying to overthrow. And I didn't see the same thing going on in Vietnam.
Counterinsurgency experts are wary of attempts to defeat a guerrilla army without popular support.
You go into a village, whether it be in Bolivia or in El Salvador or in Vietnam, and if the response of the civilian population is they close the door and tell you nothing, then you're probably doing something wrong. But if the doors are open, the bottles are being uncorked, the tortillas or the rice and the beans are being made, and they tell you don't go down that trail because something bad's going to happen, then you're probably doing something right. And that's, to me, that kind of grassroots intelligence is something you can't buy, and satellites aren't going to tell you. There's only one source for that, and that's the civilian population that believes that you're part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Lost any men here? Well, I've got 5.
Vietnam is the first war that allows reporters virtually unlimited access to the battlefield.
A lot of us would talk about how they would interview like these 18, 19-year-old infantry guys coming off an operation, and how they would almost put words in their mouth, maybe not, but I mean there were a lot of loaded questions to those kids, and they would appeal to their sort of macho, yeah, we really shot them up type thing, and it seemed that that's what they wanted to hear, that, oh yeah, we really wiped them out, or they wanted a kind of bloodthirsty image from the infantry guys.
In contrast, government-sanctioned reports are tightly controlled.
I was basically a reporter, but we went out with infantry units, but we couldn't really say anything bad happened, basically. We couldn't say a Marine got wounded. I mean, it was to that extent. And we were, I guess, more public relations than reporters.
News coverage beams the harsh realities of combat into the living rooms of America. Some military leaders claim the media is eroding the nation's will to achieve victory.
Every reporter was looking for headlines. He was looking for the lead story. He did not have the perspective. I mean, he wanted to give a story that would be sensational enough, so it would be the lead item on the television or the headlines of the New York Times, and that was their motivation. And there was no incentive for them to try to exercise the objectivity, which of course I had to deal with.
In March 1968, LBJ announces that he will not seek re-election. He is succeeded by Richard Nixon, who claims he has a secret plan for ending the war.
Vietnam, a time to remember, will continue.
January 1969. Peace talks begin in Paris, but little changes on the killing fields of Vietnam. Politicians who previously supported the war begin to waver.
How long are we going to be committed in these places, and what are we going to do to the priorities of America?
Well, you're the
These are
senator.
the
I hope
important
you have
questions.
the answers.
Well, I know the important thing is that is an answer. Give it a try. That's what I'm saying. Give it a try. No, I don't have all the answers. I realize that there's a certain dilemma involved in all this. I know this is a hard task, but after all, I mean, you can't go on forever. We've been engaged there now for years and years and years, and our young men are dying.
The new administration adopts a policy of Vietnamization, a gradual transition of authority to the South Vietnamese. But as the hope of victory fades and combat is reduced to daily survival, discipline begins to break down.
Officers who had incurred the degree of hostility among their own troops sometimes would be the target of a grenade incident. If somebody who was trying to break up dope smoking or drug use in a particular unit might find himself being a target. We had all kinds of problems in that brigade. It was a sick unit, and the disease was Vietnam.
The increasingly difficult task of improving troop morale is taken on by groups such as the Red Cross and more venerable institutions.
Hiya, Maggie. Nice to see you. How are you, sweetheart?
Do that. You're real.
Is that your... Where's your girls? You got some girls?
Some down here.
Come here. Come on up here. Come on up here, girls. Come on.
Come on, gang.
Come on, Red Cross girls. Come on up here.
Get up here.
It was very nice because he saluted the Red Cross. We did not get good press over there or here. We just did our jobs, and the guys we visited on our programs appreciated us, and we knew that they were glad for what we had, but our general reputation was not that good, and he said, I just wanted to get you up here and thank you. And it was like, yeah.
Moments of such carefree camaraderie are brief. As the struggle for civil rights continues in America, racial tensions increase in base camps across Vietnam.
There were places that you could go in Vietnam that if you walked through it and you were black, you would be harmed. If you walked through it, if you were white, you would be harmed.
Only on the battlefield, where constant fear of death strips away prejudice, is equality the order of the day.
If you were in the bush, in the field, on operations or on patrols, the blacks and whites got along like you wouldn't believe. Under the most inhuman, adverse situations, we were at our most humane towards one another.
The role of American women in Vietnam is limited almost exclusively to nursing. But the Navy eventually allows one woman to join its staff in Saigon.
I think there was great concern within the Navy, at least I was told there was concern within the Navy, that sending first me and subsequently probably about a half a dozen other women officers to Vietnam would start a demand that couldn't be stopped, so that the women were chosen very carefully, very individually, and there was never a call put out for women volunteers. As a matter of fact, they were discouraged.
Since the beginning of the war, thousands of citizens have been drafted. At first, deferments are offered to those fortunate enough to attend college, thereby shifting the burden to the poor. Even supporters of the war are critical of this system.
There's no question but what the operation of the draft laws is in favor of the middle class or the upper class, those who can afford the education, and against those who cannot afford it. And I think it's wrong.
It didn't take a genius to figure out that a lot of my friends, particularly in the suburbs, for some reason were able to get out of going. The temple I was in, for example, I remember the rabbi asked me once to come and give a talk about Vietnam, and I told him, well, you might not like what you hear, because obviously I'm the only person you can ask. Nobody else, there's no other veteran that went to Vietnam in the whole temple except me.
Like, I got drafted because I couldn't afford to go to college. If my father had been a lawyer, right, instead of a laborer, the chances of me going to Vietnam would have been slim. Right, so that, I think, is the area that bothered me the most when I realized that, that there was enormous social or class discrimination when it came to combat.
Demonstrations against the draft grow increasingly confrontational. In the spring of 1970, the Selective Service Headquarters in Rhode Island becomes the target of a carefully planned act of sabotage.
We took this action because of our opposition to United States military involvement in Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia, opposition to United States imperialism elsewhere in the Third World, and our opposition to conscription and racism at home.
what jeopardized the lives of American troops and what jeopardized the lives of Vietnamese was the U.S. government sending American troops to Vietnam into harm's way, as it were. Our view was that the best way to protect American troops and Vietnamese lives was to bring the troops home. In the tradition of Martin Luther King and Thoreau and Gandhi, we said, if we are to be arrested and suffer consequences for our actions, here we are, arrest us. Our act was clearly aimed at property, not at people. It may come close to the line, but in our view, it was clearly nonviolent.
The public announcement of such radical action draws a crowd, including agents of the FBI and the U.S. Attorney, Lincoln Ullman.
I guess the media and everyone expected there to be an arrest that day, and when the speech was over, the only interest we had was to record the speech for evidentiary purposes, and then I directed the FBI to leave the scene, and we left, and that was the end of it.
Ullman has his own concerns about the war, expressed during an unsuccessful campaign for Congress.
An escalation of the war merely means more dependency of the South Vietnamese government on our military policy, and I don't think that's the proper course. I think that we should take immediate steps for the de-Americanization of this war. We've been over there now for 3 years. I think it's about time that the South Vietnamese people were given more of a role in this conflict.
But the distinction between lawful speech and illegal action cannot be ignored.
So we let the thing die down. We had identified who they were, we knew who they were, we had the evidence sufficient to indict, and I waited, I can't recall how long after, and then we did indict, and both of them ultimately pled guilty to the offense.
News of violent opposition to the war reaches the troops in Vietnam. The fact that most protesters claim their anger is directed at government policy, not servicemen, is often lost in the shouting.
The difficulty was that some student groups, particularly those more to the left, were critical of our soldiers in Vietnam. And I always felt that was not just wrong, but it was kind of hateful, and it was misguided. And what we were trying to communicate was a sympathy with the soldiers there and those that were being killed and wounded and so on, and a feeling that, you know, this was not something to die for. This was not a war that was in America's national security interest. It wasn't a war that we should be fighting, and it wasn't something that they should be dying for.
Leave me the hope of a new tomorrow. Fill my cup, sing it for Nixon, sing it for him. Leave me the sunshine out of the fall. Listen to us, Mr. Nixon.
To some, the ceaseless chant of protest becomes an unpatriotic tune, one that evokes longing for simpler times, when defiance meant treason.
We still had an open, free society. And there was no way, even if President Johnson and President Nixon wanted to curtail the enemy's propaganda, they were in no position to do so, because there was no declared war. If a war had been declared, then efforts could have been taken, and appropriately, to suppress dissent.
Five years after his first visit, John Chafee returns to Vietnam, this time as Secretary of the Navy.
The second time around, the thing that impressed me, and I guess appalled me, was the size of the forces we had there. I never forget flying up from the southern part, flying north. I guess it was probably from Saigon, flying north up to the DMZ, and it looked like looking down on Long Island. Instead of houses everywhere, there were tents everywhere. American Army tents. And then, of course, we got up to where the Marines were, and they're very Da Nang and very substantial Marine forces up there. And I think that's what jolted me. Say, we're really in for something here. And it made me realize that this thing had gotten out of hand. This was a major war that was going on, and of course by that time the deaths had escalated, and so we were losing every day losing people. I mean, not just 5 or 10. I'm talking 20, 50, 100 soldiers a day. And I felt that came to me as quite a jolt.
In an attempt to destroy enemy sanctuaries, U.S. forces are sent across the border into neighboring Cambodia. Before they enter what the soldiers call Indian territory, the jungles are probed by scout helicopters and raked with fire by Cobra gunships. The air cavalry scouts view themselves as drawn from the same stock as Kit Carson and other legends of the Wild West. Those who survived the early missions accept future assignments with gallows humor.
I remember standing up in a briefing once and being advised that I was going to be the lead scout that was going to be going into a particularly difficult area. And of course the comment from across the room was, "Can I have your watch?" And somebody else wanted my stereo. You know, is that sort of thing, because laughing at you. "You ain't coming back from this one, man. Can I have your watch?"
What you are about to see is a typical helicopter scouting mission. What you will hear is an actual combat transmission recorded by Warrant Officer Supruck.
This place is unbelievable. Looks like downtown Hanoi. We got a sniper. Oh, we're taking fire. We're taking fire. Taking fire. Taking in fire. Let's go on. Take a hit. I think we took a hit. Allow it to us. Oh, I'm coming.
I was scared to death. Well, we were scared to death the whole time. The whole time. What happens is your voice goes up a couple of octaves, and at the time when you're 8 or 10 feet off of the ground and doing about 20 miles an hour at that point, and somebody opens up on you at very close range with an automatic weapon, it'll certainly get your attention.
The decision to invade Cambodia raises a storm of protest on campuses across the nation.
Peaceful demonstrations, petitions, and speeches have failed. Now our only weapon against the war makers is by disrupting one of their tools, the university. While our intent is nonviolent, we must shut down URI.
With the future of this nation and the world at stake, Brown as an institution can no longer say it is neutral. Brown itself must oppose this expansion of the war.
At Kent State in Ohio, National Guardsmen fire into a group of rock-throwing student protesters, killing 4 and wounding 11.
Well, what happened at Kent State, of course, was an obvious tragedy. I mean, again, we went into the politics of what was happening there, but the fact that students lost their life in any way, shape, or form over a protest, to us was a tragedy. But the people who were doing the protesting didn't understand. Nobody wanted to invade Cambodia like, oh boy, let's go to war in another country. But what was happening to us was the Americans and Vietnamese were getting pasted on a regular basis by North Vietnamese units that would come across the border, do serious damage to us, and then get back across the border, and we weren't allowed to chase them.
Pressure on American prisoners to add their voices to those criticizing U.S. foreign policy intensifies.
What the North Vietnamese wanted to do was to convince us to join the anti-war movement. They wanted us to actively participate, to make statements and write letters and to, do whatever to try and bring the war to an end through public pressure. The anti-war movement was viewed as an enemy force, and it was in a way a defensive mechanism on our part that we constructed, defense mechanisms against the Vietnamese, but we also had other things to deal with as well. And so we viewed the anti-war protesters in a very adverse light.
At the United Nations, Senator Claiborne Pell, a longtime opponent of the war, calls for better treatment for American POWs.
I believe it is obvious that the North Vietnamese have merely made an attempt to cast a veil over their refusal to accord proper and reasonable treatment of the prisoners or permit access to them. In fact, they have signaled their intent to use these unfortunate captured military men as political pawns. they are kept isolated, solitarily confined, and often have been cruelly shackled and abused.
Bring home! Bring our brothers home!
Some returning veterans join organizations opposed to the war, voicing criticism that is not easily dismissed.
I got hooked up with this Vietnam Veterans Against the War with this group that were many guys like myself that were that we thought we would make a bit of a difference because we were like, people couldn't say that we were peaceniks and chickens and, you know, all the bad things they used to say about people that really were against the war, which weren't true, but things that people could say. It'd be difficult to tell someone who's been in Vietnam twice that, you know, that you're a chicken.
The sight of decorated soldiers discarding their medals at the Capitol stirs the nation's conscience.
I could recall one very vivid scene where this woman came up with framed medals and was going to throw them away, and at the last minute couldn't because that's all she had left from her son. You know, so those kinds of things really just made you want to fight that much harder to end the war because you could just see what it was doing to the country.
As the middle class grows increasingly disenchanted with the war, the end of American involvement draws near. But no one can predict the fate of South Vietnam.
Vietnam, a time to remember, will continue.
I need him in the Senate, and you're going to put him in the Senate. John Chafee.
November 1972. Richard Nixon arrives in Rhode Island, campaigning for re-election on a promise of peace with honor.
We're grateful for the wonderful leadership you've given this nation toward the road for peace, and we look forward to 4 more years of that outstanding leadership. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you. We have made a breakthrough in the negotiations. We are going to reach the agreement which will end this war and end it with honor and without surrender.
The options that President Nixon had, I suppose, were to stick it out at a lower level, and the other is to have the Vietnamization. The third is just get out. Just say we've lost and forget it.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
On January 27, 1973, an agreement ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam is signed in Paris. Whether the treaty is in the best interests of South Vietnam remains to be seen.
We felt that we have been abandoned and we have been left behind, and also a little bit disappointed because we knew that we have to fight alone. And it wasn't easy because the North Vietnamese had been receiving full support from Russians and Chinese. And we knew that we had a tough time ahead of us. And yes, it was sad. It was, very disappointed. But we have to accept the truth.
The United States withdraws from Vietnam, ending almost 10 years of military presence in that country. For nearly 600 American prisoners of war, the long-awaited day of deliverance is finally at hand. The first stop is an air base near Saigon. Slipping into the crowd of officials and dignitaries, the son of an American diplomat silently bears witness to this historic moment.
That was the most remarkable sight I may have ever seen. We went out to the airport, Taunton Airport, where I'd been a lot, but I hadn't been there at night very often, and it was night. And we stood at one edge of that enormous area and just waited and waited and waited, and there was a great deal of anticipation. And then they shut off the engines, and there was the whine of the engines winding down, and then a long pause, and then people started to come out into this very, very bright light, and blinking, tall, thin, pale, some of them able to walk and stand, but some were brought out on stretchers. And on this one occasion, you could really feel that the bonds among the group of people as Americans were far and away first and foremost, and the separate beliefs and opinions and tasks that they had at that moment were put aside.
Among the first to be released is Navy Lieutenant Commander Porter Halliburton. 7 years of deprivation and suffering have not broken his spirit. He has survived through prayer, shared compassion, and a sense of duty. Most remarkably, during his ordeal, he has managed to compose and memorize poetry.
She stands before me, silent, across the wide river. Her smile seen dimly through the damp fog. Watching through my peephole, I can only whisper her name, Freedom. And I, within my hardened shell, await rebirth.
The reception for POWs throughout America is appropriately joyous. And in fact, early in the war, many returning servicemen have been greeted with considerable fanfare.
Behind me, 4 ships of Destroyer Squadron 20 returning to their home port after 4 months away from that port. They spent 7 weeks off the coast of Vietnam, where they shelled enemy targets on shore. So today here at Newport Naval Base, wild joy, happiness, and of course, pandemonium.
But as time wears on, far too many veterans return from combat only to face indifference, hostility, and scorn.
They said during the movies you can take a Purple Heart and go down to the store or to the restaurant and get a free cup of coffee. So I'm home in Pittsburgh and I went down to this corner store on 8th Avenue and walked in and I asked the lady, can I get a free cup of coffee with this Purple Heart medal? She said, yeah, as long as you put down 10 cents with it, which was the cost of the coffee at that time, 67, you know. So I felt shameful for doing that and felt so embarrassed that I just walked out and took it home.
The following year I went back to school. It was my job almost, I think, to defend the United States policies in Vietnam and around the world and the military-industrial machine. The rest of the class against you and with the professor who, probably was more on their side than anybody's, and trying to defend a position that, you just happened to be a part of. I found that tough, real tough.
I came back here when I came back from Vietnam, and I remember being in uniform after work at a grocery store with 2 bags of groceries in my arms and having somebody walk up to me and say, "You're a baby killer." And that was a real shock. I'd never had anybody say that to me before. I was so stunned I just had to walk away. I didn't know what to do.
We were never thanked. We didn't have the parades that everybody had. People, because we were so visible, you'd see it on TV every night. We were the targets of their distrust of the government or the hatred of the war.
Where I think it got me was when I returned home. And at that time, Rhode Island was kind of an apartheid system. There were whole communities that you couldn't get apartments in. And discrimination was 1,000,000 times more painful for me after Vietnam. It was much more humiliating. I think that I may have accepted it as just being a part of life when I left. And when I came back, it felt much worse.
In Vietnam, the ceasefire agreement has been violated almost since it was signed. Over the next 2 years, communist forces will continue to gain ground in the south. By late April 1975, Saigon is surrounded, and a panic-stricken population struggles to escape the tightening noose.
I went home and I picked up my wife and 2 kids, and we sat on a motorcycle. I drove with my son sitting on the gas tank and my wife on the back holding another son and a little handbag. So we left the house and we went to the naval base. And finally, by looking at the amount of people on the pier, and I suggest the admiral that to get underway. And approaching 50 miles limit of the Philippines, we had been ordered to dump all the ammunition into the water, and also to bring down all our Republic of Vietnam flags from all of those ships. We all cried. We cried very hard. We knew that we lost the country. We now became refugees.
One tragic legacy of the war is the fact that more than 2,000 United States servicemen are still listed as missing in action. The Republic of Vietnam claims that it cannot account for over 300,000 of their own people. The sincerity of its concern regarding America's MIA problem has often been questioned. The idea that some Americans are still being held against their will has been the premise for several popular action rescue movies. But Senator John Chafee, a combat veteran of 2 wars, questions the validity of such notions.
Now, you might say, well, there's still several thousand unaccounted for. If you can lose somebody in an airplane in the western part of Rhode Island, as has happened, and take a long time to find them, you can imagine what it is when a plane crashes in one of those jungles. And because some people are still missing, to me, is not proof that they're holding somebody. And in every war we've ever been in, we've had unaccounted for people, the unknown soldier. That's regrettably part of the price of war.
Did it make us any wiser? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there'll probably always be another Vietnam someplace in this world. The only question is, are we going to be the ones to go in and try to rescue it every time? Because you'll still find the same kind of guys that you had the last time who are willing to go and do it for you if that's what you want.
My proudest thing was when my oldest kid graduated from high school and got a scholarship to Marion Military Institute in Alabama, and told us before he left for school, he said, "I just want you two to know that I'm really proud that you were in Vietnam."
I would like to also take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude and appreciation toward all American service people who have sacrificed their lives for a just and noble cause in Vietnam. And we will never forget those friends.
Almost 3 million Americans served in Vietnam. Today, the vast majority have taken their rightful place in society. Proud citizens, quietly adding their strength to a nation that owes them more than it will ever know.